This is the first talk of the season sponsored by the Great Cities Institute. It's also the first talk sponsored by the Center for Urban Economic Development. Our speaker today is Susan Christopherson, Professor of City and Regional Planning at Cornell. She's a geographer whose career is based on a commitment to the integration of scholarly work and public engagement. And so it's very much in line with what all of us do here. Her research interests are diverse, but they focus generally on political economic policy, especially its spatial dimensions. She's truly a public intellectual as well as a scholar. Her public engagement has spanned areas from the local to the global. She's been a consultant to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the UN Conference on Trade and Development, as well as to national, state, and local governments. And she's currently chair of the International Economic Development Council Advisory Committee on Higher Education and Economic Development. Most important for this talk, Susan is one of the academic leaders of the small but growing, we hope growing movement among academic planners and geographers, and also among some planning practitioners to take high road manufacturing seriously. She is interested in promoting high wage, high productivity manufacturing that offers good jobs, especially to less educated workers, and is especially interested in the spatial dimensions that how planning and geography can contribute to that. So in that sense, she definitely shares our specific interests at QED, as well as the more general interests and commitments of the Great Cities Institute. So with that, I will introduce Susan Christopherson, who will be talking today about the impact that the financialization of the U.S. economy has had or may have had on manufacturing activity. What anything have you heard about that?
Okay. I wanted to treat this more like a seminar because I have a fairly complicated argument and I want to try to simplify it. And then open it up and have discussion, because I think I have a paper that I welcome that it's going to be on the website here and is available to people. And so for very detailed information on my thinking about this and the sort of integrated aspects of the argument, I refer you to the paper. As Howard said, I've had a long time interest in manufacturing. I'm a Midwesterner, and I came of age during the period of the great deindustrialization of America debates, and I was kind of intrigued by this question of the renaissance of manufacturing in the United States. In fact, I was thrilled by it, to tell the truth, because I thought, well, here's a chance for manufacturing to reemerge in the United States in those locations, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest, where there was a concentration of capacity in certain kinds of industries. I've looked, for example, very closely at the photonics industry in Rochester, which is an industry that is based in optics and laser imaging. It comes out of, as many of our Midwest and Northeast industries do, out of investments in very large companies originally, in that case Kodak, and what geographers refer to as economies of concentration, so that there was an excellent technical workforce, particularly in areas like quality control and measurement devices. There were engineering programs at the University of Rochester, there still are. There was a technical training program at Monroe Community College, and there was a investment by Kodak up until the 1980s in the creation of facilities, services, the whole apparatus that would create an industrial strength in that region. Now, as we all know, Kodak went bankrupt. But I started looking at companies in the 1980s, and what I found was even at that time, those companies were, that Kodak was downsizing when I first went to Cornell, and the companies that were emerging were first subcontractors to Kodak, and then they decided they hated Kodak because they didn't want to be subcontractors to Kodak. It was a miserable situation. And so what they started to do was to look for other markets. And they began to coalesce into what is called the Rochester Regional Photonics Cluster, which is one of the most unusual ones in the US. And to essentially begin to buy and sell from one another, and also to look for global markets for their new high technology products. Actually, when Kodak went bankrupt, I was asked by the media what I thought about this, and I said, well, it really doesn't matter anymore, because what's happened is that there are 120 firms in Rochester that are actually incredibly important to the global optics and laser imaging industry. They're one of the top centers in the world. Now, the problem is that they don't create very many jobs. I was just there last week talking to them, and to the photonics cluster guys who are still thriving, actually thriving. So then the question is, how does this get leveraged and turned into manufacturing jobs again? So I was very intrigued several years ago to learn from my students and from other people about this new kind of manufacturing calculus, location calculus that was emerging, and affecting the kinds of decisions that firms were making when they wanted to make a location choice globally. And this location calculus, the most important thing about it, there's a number of different features, but the most important thing about it is that the proportion of production cost that is attributable to labor cost has gone way down. So there's something that joins what's happening in Rochester, where they have 120 thriving firms with global markets, and the propensity or desire of firms to look at the United States again as an option for location. Labor cost just isn't that important anymore. It's important in some industries, in apparel, obviously. Even in food processing, but that's a whole other story. I'm from New York, so I'm all about yogurt, you know. So I started to look at this location calculus, and I got very excited about this. And because it just seemed, as someone who studies industry location, that here was the answer. You know, labor cost wasn't that important anymore, but firms were looking at the United States again because other costs were becoming more important, transportation costs. They wanted to protect their intellectual property because they were doing more product and process innovation, and they didn't want to face the problem of reverse engineering in China. And so they that became a consideration. They wanted, they were very often in smaller batch markets. They wanted quicker turnover, and they wanted to be closer to their markets. So there was a whole list of factors that I thought, wow, here it is. We're going to be able to attract manufacturing back to the United States. And indeed, it is happening. It is happening. The only problem is, when reality hit me, was that during the 2000s in particular, and we lost a lot of manufacturing jobs in the 1980s, but in the 2000s we lost 4 million jobs. And we've gained back approximately 500,000 to 600,000 jobs. They're coming back for all the reasons that I've described. But I started to see this kind of slowdown in this surge, and also began to read the critical literature on some of the dimensions, the aspects of manufacturing sustainability, let's say, manufacturing growth, manufacturing expansion. What would make this more than a trickle? What would bring back 1 million jobs, 1.5 million jobs? Not hoping to go back to the millions of jobs in the 1980s, but to go back to really develop a substantial manufacturing economy. Now, I should say that this is not just an issue in the United States, this is also an issue in the UK, where I spend a lot of time, because I'm a geographer, and the UK is the home of geography. There's very little geography in the US for complicated reasons, but the British had an empire, and they needed to know about the people they were oppressing. So Prince William was a geography major, so geography is a big deal. And it's wonderful to go to a country where I get in the taxi cab and they ask me who I am or what I do, and I say, I'm a geographer, and they say, oh, that's wonderful. Oh, I know exactly what you do. I took that in 2nd grade and 4th grade and 7th grade. So I spent a lot of time in the UK, and I realized that in the UK, the same question was arising. And in the UK, it's very often portrayed as a question, as an issue of rebalancing the economy. And this has become very, very important in the last 5 to 7 years because of the concern that the UK economy has become so dependent on financial services. And so they are talking about how they need to rebalance. That term isn't used in the US so much, but I think that the sentiment, the idea, the feeling is the same, that there are good reasons for having strong manufacturing in an economy. The reasons are employment, the quality of the jobs is better in manufacturing in general, and Peter and I were just talking about the fact that they are there's some problem because of the decline in manufacturing on the quality of the jobs that are available. We can talk about that later. Employers are not willing to pay the kinds of wages that would be necessary to maintain a very highly skilled manufacturing labor force. But employment is the one that's typically pointed to. Exports. When you export, the balance of trade is really influenced by your manufacturing capacity. This is why the Germans are in such great shape. There are some very strong reasons for wanting a strong manufacturing sector, and for trying to potentially rebalance in some way, to understand if you've gone in the wrong direction, if you're the UK. And the US is a much bigger, more complicated economy, so it isn't as skewed as London and the North in the UK. There were these pieces sitting there of good reasons to have a diverse manufacturing, a diverse economy with manufacturing as an important component of it, and a new location calculus with all these features, particularly the decreasing importance of labor costs as a proportion of total production costs. And I'm from the era where my cohort at UC Berkeley Michael Storper wrote a book called The Labor Theory of Location. That was what supposedly was driving companies to outsource and to go out of the country. If that is not a factor, then you would see this opening. So with that in mind, I began to look at some of the skeptics, though. You have to sort of, if you go around saying, "Oh, it's wonderful," and there are always people who look at you like this. And so I started reading the work of the skeptics, in particular Rob Atkinson, of the ITIF, what's it called, Howard?
Information Technology and Innovation Foundation.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, he spoke here last year.
And they wrote a very important paper on looking at this whole question from a skeptical point of view. And what they pointed out, and the argument they made, which was very convincing to me, was that in fact what we had experienced in the 2000s was not just a move up the ladder toward more advanced technology and toward more sophisticated jobs, more value-added jobs. We had experienced disinvestment in our manufacturing economy. 4 million jobs was not simply going to be explained by the replacement with higher value-added jobs. There had been genuine disinvestment. And the reasons for that disinvestment had to do with how firms were making decisions about what they were going to invest in, what their options were, what their strategies were for making money. And during the 2000s, actually going back to the deregulation that began in the 1980s, those incentives and strategies began to change. So firms were looking at different ways, including non-financial firms, at different ways of making money. And investing in manufacturing capacity was not the highest and best use of your capital. And that's, in a nutshell, that's the situation we have today, which is that there are not strong incentives for companies to invest in the kind of facilities, labor force skills, product and process innovation, as opposed to short-term intellectual property investments that would build a long-term sustainable manufacturing sector. So that's sort of the kernel of my argument. But so how do we explain this? Because I think it's important to recognize that this is affecting certain economies and not others. So this is very much a phenomenon affecting the US and the UK and Australia, and to some extent Canada too. The Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-American economies, which are economies built around kind of mercantile capitalism, that shareholder value, publicly traded firms, that place a very high priority on individual property rights to intellectual property, for example. There's, and I've done a lot of work over the years comparing the US economy with the German economy. The German economy was moving somewhat in this direction. I don't want to pretend that, you know, the Germans just sat there and didn't get Deutsche Bank, obviously got into this game to some extent. But there are institutions and incentives in the German economy that slow this down, that cause firms to want to continue to invest in their workforce, in facilities, in the kinds of capacity that is going to maintain a very sophisticated export-oriented manufacturing sector. They really they've had employment losses too, but and obviously that's going to happen if you are moving toward more high technology, less labor intensive activities. But there's a difference. They have, if you look at these two economies, the US and Germany, in Germany there's been employment loss that's much more attributable to this kind of, to the movement up the value ladder. In the US, the explanation is closer to one that has to do with disinvestment in manufacturing, because there are other alternatives for making money. When I started looking at the skeptics, I turned to this literature, and I wanted to try to find a different way of explaining what was going on, because one of the things I'd like to say in this venue is that I think the way that we explain what has happened and the sources of the problems that we have in building a manufacturing sector or manufacturing sectors, I think the explanations are important because they will determine what we can do in the future. They will determine the kinds of policy choices we make. And in the US, and I found this peculiar, and I found it peculiar even with Rob Atkinson's paper. There was an analysis saying that manufacturing companies have disinvested. They've gone toward strategies that are going to allow them to make money through debt, through taking advantage of tax advantages in countries like Ireland, where they can essentially offshore certain activities, where they can in effect become much more of a financial service firm than a manufacturing firm. They can leverage their, and I see this very much with GE in its activities in New York. GE is sort of a poster child for this activity. Becoming more of a financial service firm and less a manufacturing firm, but you can leverage the fact that you still have capital equipment. You still have that base in manufacturing. So you're benefiting from the lower risk associated with the fact that you have that equity property, and yet you can use that and move into riskier, more financial sector transactions. Now, so there are these kinds of strategies, and I don't have a full accounting of them, but they're explained in a literature on financialization, which it is a literature that talks about very basically the move of the US economy and the UK economy, typically, toward where strategies where shareholder value has become the dominant measure of a firm's success, where you have publicly traded firms and they are driven to do anything to increase shareholder value, and so they are driven to go toward higher value financial instruments in order to keep their shareholder value up. This set of strategies has been written about by people, and it's an increasing number of people right now. People, particularly Greta Krippner, who's written about this, and there are a group of people at Manchester University in England who have written a lot about this, looking at General Electric as a firm, as an individual firm doing this. But what was really important about Greta Krippner's analysis of this was that she said, you can't just look at individual firms. This is also, I think, an Anglo-American tendency to say, there's this bad firm, and then there's that bad firm, and there's this bad apple, and then there's that one. She said, you have to look at the shape of the economy. You have to look at how the incentives that are shaping the economy as a whole have changed. And she did look somewhat at this question of the so-called financialization of non-financial firms. So the idea here is that financialization isn't just that we have more financial service industries, or that the banks are developing new kinds of innovative products in the financial services that we learned a lot about in the last 5 years, or that there were some bad actors in the mortgage market, but that in fact the whole economy has been inflected by this move toward financial services. So, and toward the use of financial instruments to make money, or to so that people, in fact, have now started to study things like the role of debt in people's lives, the role of credit as an asset, which when I was growing up, I didn't have a credit card. I mean, credit cards were not, people didn't have credit cards. And so if we think about how the world has changed, particularly in certain economies, I remember going to Germany and trying to pay with a credit card, and they got very nervous and scared. I think they've got credit cards now, but they use debit cards. It was a different concept. They probably still do. But the whole idea of the ability to get credit as a personal asset, as something that you have. So the people who write about financialization, one of the things that's interesting about them, I think, is that they are looking at financial services. They are looking at the financialization of non-financial firms. I study the motion picture and television industry, which is very financialized, which is one of the reasons independent film has difficulty getting financed now. So this is, it's across the economy. It's not simply something that's just confined to to the financial service industry. But I think that the arguments that have been made in the United States about this, and in the UK too, policymakers don't want to go there. They don't want to address the incentives that are driving firms to look for short-term returns instead of investing in these longer-term investments in product and process innovation that would be required, for example, to build manufacturing. And so what the argument that I started the things I started to look at were some of the problems that had to do with financialization of the economy as a whole, and the barriers they were creating to taking advantage of this new location calculus. So we've got one set of forces that's creating tremendous advantages or not advantages, but incentives for firms to come to the United States, come back to the United States. And there have been some companies like Caterpillar that have done this in a big way, but they're producing very heavy, high-value equipment, so there's good reasons for them to be here. But the problems seem to revolve around the lack of investment capital for longer term investments. And so I had been doing a certain amount of interviewing, particularly with the companies in Rochester, because they have all kinds of advantages. They are a prime site for firms to move to return to the U.S., German firms for foreign investment. And what they tell me is that they can't get the kind of bridging capital or long-term capital that is going to allow them to expand their businesses. They can get venture capital to some extent in that kind of location, but they said that they can't get anything that goes beyond 5 years. That's really the outer limit. And in manufacturing, if you're going to actually build facilities, capital, there's a longer term investment horizon. So one of the issues, I think one of the big issues is this disincentive for longer term investment. Another issue is the inability or unwillingness, and I'd say it's inability. It's an incentive. To me, I don't think about this as individuals being malevolent. I think about how they're driven by incentives. Not to train their workforce. They want the workforce to come in with the skills that are appropriate to that firm, that moment. They want flexibility, and they want the ready skills. But they don't want to pay for them. They don't want to pay the relatively higher wages that would be necessary to maintain a technically skilled workforce. And then this is a controversial thing to say because there's supposedly a big labor shortage in manufacturing. But the reason I can say this with some certainty is that I talk to economic development professionals who are conservative guys, the golf club guys, as I refer to them. I belong to the International Economic Development Council. I work with these guys who are out there dealing with firms all the time. They give subsidies. They're not liberals. Let's just put it that way. They're not people from the Economic Policy Institute who are saying that the argument about the labor shortage is a crock. No, these guys are. What they say to me, and I could, in some numbers, is I can't get the employers to pay enough money. That's why they can't get the workforce that they need. And if a young person can make as much money becoming a manager at Dunkin' Donuts as they can after taking a technical degree in some machine tool, computerized technology. The question is whether it's worth it for that young person to do that. And then because these firms are sophisticated, they necessarily have to invest in training themselves. They can't assume that a person is going to come in. It's not the 1980s or 1970s anymore where somebody came in and just did this. They have to be able to be trained. And companies see that as a problem rather than an opportunity. And again, it's because they may be driven by the need, if they're publicly traded, to show returns much more quickly. And so there's an incentive there. And then there are other questions too that have to do with investment in facilities, investment in product and process innovation, which the United States has really doesn't think about. I think I'd like to kind of talk about that a little bit, because I think that's where I kind of like to end my talk. On this question of innovation, all we hear about is innovation. It's like the I word. Just innovation. I'm so sick of innovation. I just need you to use some other word. But people don't tell you what they mean by innovation. And innovation is a very complicated idea. We've got, as far as I'm concerned, two kinds of innovation in the United States now, and we way privilege one type of innovation. We want something that's going to go like this and return money. Biosciences, computer sciences, that's it. So our universities, for example, including mine, and I'll tell you, this argument does not make me popular. Universities invest their technology transfer offices, their capacity for innovation in those two industries across the United States. They're not paying attention to the steel industry and the photonics industry and the apparel industry and the textile industry the way that they did in the 1980s or 70s, and the way that the German firms have these connections. It isn't that we didn't ever do this, but we're not doing it now. And so I'm on the listserv for entrepreneurship at Cornell. I was a professor of entrepreneurship and personal enterprise, actually, which is kind of interesting and funny. But I am very enterprising and I'm very entrepreneurial. So, but I see all these students thinking that innovation is creating an app. Where are we going to stand on the subway platform? And I'm going to make a lot of money from that, or I'm going to, I interview the people running incubators at Cornell University. I take my students over there, and the idea is you're not building a business. No. He knows, he's a banker. You're not building a business. You're trying to develop proof of concept so you can sell this idea, this intellectual property, and make a lot of money. And we've lost, and this is understandable, and that piece of property may be bought by a company that wants to take a competitor off the market, or a company that thinks this is going to add to their portfolio. But the idea is to produce intellectual property that you can then sell. And because computer sciences and biosciences are the two industries in which you can do that most effectively, universities focus on those two industries. There's another kind of innovation, which is what I call product and process innovation. And that's innovation that's aimed at improving how we do things, moving industries up the value chain, and also producing new products that are going to have markets, have broader markets. That is really out of fashion because it takes too much time, and it isn't the kind of investment that is favored by the financial incentives driving companies right now in the United States or in the UK. And I'd say the UK is significantly worse, actually, because they're a smaller economy and they lost much more of their manufacturing capacity. They basically have it in the Northeast now, which is where all their exports are coming from. Their exports are all coming from Newcastle, and this mystifies people in London who have no idea why this should be happening. But so we have, in the U.S. we have a much more diverse economy, and we didn't completely destroy it. But so what I'd like to say as a before we get into some discussion here is I think that when we try to develop policies to address the barriers to manufacturing, to really growing a diverse manufacturing economy in the U.S. with reasonably high-paid jobs, we shouldn't just be looking at the things like corporate taxes. We can lower corporate taxes, but the effective corporate tax rate in the U.S. makes it competitive with other countries. We should be, in fact, if we're going to develop policies, we've got to develop policies that address these underlying incentives that work against longer-term investments in supply chains, in the workforce, and in the kinds of facilities and product and process innovation that's going to create a strong manufacturing sector. So I will just leave it at that. That's my complicated argument. And I hope that people would take a look at the paper. And so I would very much welcome discussion and questions, because what I've been trying to do with this paper is I'm accumulating evidence and diagrams, but I realize that if I put those up, people start looking at this. And what I wanted to do was to just basically make this argument about incentives and what I think are the underlying sources of barriers to to taking advantage of what is a kind of a pivotal moment where a country like the U.S. is saying, yes, well, we hear this in the present, yes, manufacturing, we want to encourage manufacturing. So if we're going to really do that, then we have to look at what incentives are operating against that. And I would say that they're incentives coming from the same thing that created the financial crisis, which is still with us, obviously. So, questions? Yes.
Thanks for that, by the way. It's a lot of interesting things you're throwing out on the table. I've been doing some research on the LIBOR scandal, and that's brought me into the history of LIBOR. And one of the things that I sort of uncovered in looking at the development of LIBOR in the 1960s and 1970s was the degree to which American banks, seeking to get a foothold in the UK market, sort of developed this new style of lending. And the style of lending was very different from what UK banks had done in the past, which typically was to look at a firm and assess its value as a conglomerate of collateral. So
yes.
All the physical things it owned, they would add them up, and that would be the value of the firm, and it would land to a certain proportion of that value.
Right.
American firms developed what we might call a going concern approach, which said, let's look at the ability of this firm to generate profits in the future, and we'll be willing to, on the basis of that credit assessment, or that
yes.
kind of goodwill assessment, to make loans that are essentially unsecured. And that narrative, I think, resonates in both your analysis and the way that we might think about the sort of current moment for finance. In arguments that say the U.S. model really has some strengths in addressing the kinds of problems that you've addressed, in that, free markets for financial capital, somebody's going to smell an opportunity for profit. And if there are barriers somewhere along the way to capital finding its way into these firms, then a set of quick fixes to financial markets, aka kind of removing barriers within markets, financial markets themselves, to remove the blockages to free flow of capital, will be the ultimate fix. And that the problem really isn't one about the particularities of manufacturing. The problem is one about we kind of have over-regulated finance. And so that sort of, I think, turns your conclusion on its head, that the problem isn't kind of what got us into the financial crisis. It's that we haven't really gone far enough to deregulate finance and kind of open up lending innovation, financial innovation, to kind of tap these needs. I wonder the degree to which that argument, what you might say about that argument, and I guess really, if I have a question, it's where in fact do the disincentives lie? Do they lie in kind of the essential nature of manufacturing, which is going to complicate any sort of form of firm finance that is longer term at the current juncture, or do they lie as these financial modernization arguments would say in the overall structure of finance and the kinds of barriers that we're throwing up in the wake of the crisis?
I think that they lie in the deregulation of banking. And I don't want to simplify this too much because I think there are multiple things going on. And I do think that oddly the U.S. always has some capacity to figure out some new solutions. It's the advantage it has over the UK, strangely enough, which drives them nuts. They're very glum. If you ever listen, I listen to the BBC every day, all the time, and Americans are like, solve this problem. We're going to do something about this. I've given that up, but I think the deregulation of banking had a profound effect because it created other opportunities for profit apart from loans, from conventional loans. You saw the transformation of the insurance industry too, from a fairly conservative industry into one that was really having to compete with other kinds of new financial instruments. So you see this broad transformation. I also think in looking at manufacturing that one of the things that occurred was the decline of expertise in an industry. You were describing this one case, and I'm interested to hear more about that. But what I hear from these regional industrial bases is that the bankers don't know what they do. They can't make judgments the way they used to do because the banking industry has become focused on a different level of activity and different kinds of products. So you've lost that kind of expertise that was necessary to evaluate whether firm A was going to be able to continually innovate and produce product 5 years from now. You might be able to treat that firm in the way that you were saying. It's a different kind of expertise. It's a kind of financial expertise, not an expertise that has to do with whether they can produce products and get to a global market. And you see, it's that. So there's different kinds of knowledge, and I think we went in the direction of.
Can I share a very real story?
Yeah.
And this, I'm sort of like the goon in the room, but I'm an economic development professional. I've done over 250 industrial revenue bonds, financing, manufacturing, probably 30 out of the 50 states. So.
And do you golf?
And I've voted for Republicans and Democrats, and my son was in Malia Obama's nursery school class in Chicago. So take all that for what you want. And actually, my daughter is in Leah Emanuel's class. So more to the point, I think in manufacturing you have to first of all distinguish between the large firms that can access long-term 20, 30-year fixed rate financing and make a long-term decision. And they operate in a world that they can do pretty much whatever they want, the G's and all that. I think the smaller firms, whatever size revenue you want, but the small ones that don't have access to this capital are running into this banking problem. When I worked for the bank that used to be known as LaSalle in Chicago. We got gobbled up by the goons in Charlotte, got rid of all of us in Chicago, wound up going to Wells Fargo. And I would look at these deals in Chicago. We'd call up credit in California. The people in California would say, oh my God, what is this company doing with all these fixed assets on their books? Well, they're a manufacturer. oh, well, in California, we're used to export finance. We don't understand this. And you have this total disconnect between the people that are managing massive portfolios of credit and trying to optimize that versus the people in the field that are actually dealing with the people there. And I think it's, and the cynics will say, well, it's because of regulation they're doing this, or too much regulation, or not enough. But I think we have all these different things coming together that any individual firm is making a rational decision for themselves, but it's not really helping us collectively as a society, and that's the challenge.
He's a plant.
What?
I couldn't have asked for a better person to come to this.
And this wasn't a setup. I just happened to walk in the door.
I just wanted to say that I had forgotten to say that large firms and small firms operate in different worlds. And so large firms have a considerable amount of leverage. They have leverage in getting more and more subsidies from states. Because they still employ sizable numbers of people. They can get capital because they can operate in those broader markets. It is the supply chains that manufacturing needs that don't have the access to the capital. And yet the large firms say, well, where's your supply chain? Where's my supply chain?
But they don't want to give 20-year contracts to offset the risk.
Yeah.
Well, but what I've heard, and maybe this is a response to Phil's comment, is that there are sort of instances of this kind of innovation taking place, and actually the case I've heard of is coming from the Royal Bank of Scotland, so maybe the Brits they're not so averse to innovation, but I've been hearing more about this, what they call buyer-led supply chain finance, where you're basically putting up the capital and collateral of the EOM, right? Is that what it's called? Like we're the big firm who's procuring from all the other small
manufacturer.
What does that stand for? All the smaller manufacturers, you're basically putting that on the line. So you're having the Walmarts essentially sort of vouch for all of their suppliers, and but you have to get them to want to do that, and I'm not sure. I mean, this would be an interesting area of exploration, this sort of supply chain finance, because my impression it was always like, you'd get these kind of short-term lines of credit that would allow you to meet Walmart's deadline to provide 50 widgets by, or whatever, 50,000 widgets by this date, but that was always very short-term, and it was just meant for you to sort of fulfill your order. It wasn't an investment in process. It wasn't an investment in capital. But it seems like in some ways, if we are becoming more and more sort of, these kinds of complex supply chains that are anchored by a large firm, it seems like it's the large firm that can kind of go up for, that, can access that financing and sort of spread it down the supply chain. Now, what happens in your case where it didn't really matter if Kodak was there or not, I'm not sure. And so I don't really know enough about sort of what's taking place in terms of the restructuring of those supply chains to think about if this is sort of a solution for the future, because I'd imagine
the large firms play a very complicated dual role because they also compete with the small firms in the region for a labor force.
And they're applying pressure on them to keep their costs as low and their labor costs as low. And so in some ways they're sort of set up, they need them to provide whatever product it is that they're procuring from them, but they also would like them to be in a pressed to the wall, competing against all their supply. So it seems like they may hold the keys to this kind of problem, but there's also a kind of structural incentive for them to take advantage of the way things currently are.
McDonald's has not signed contracts with their vendors. They will tell you what they want. They will give you an exclusive to buy it from you once you're sourced. They will not give you a contract. How am I as a lender supposed to finance that? If you the manufacturer screw up.
Yeah, I think. So I think that the point here too is that again, there's a set of incentives, and if you're going to, there may be innovation within this framework. The approach that I'm most averse to, I have to say, is just accepting that we live in a financialized global economy and that you have to buy the large firms off. Essentially, states provide higher and higher incentives in order to attract very large firms. And I think it's gotten to the point of poor returns for for the public. In New York, one of the amazing things that happened is recently, to me it was amazing anyway, Rachel will love this too. Ed Cox, who is Richard Nixon's son-in-law, married to Tricia. So he's a very nice man. He's on television all the time. He's the head of the Republican Party in New York. Ed Cox has started talking about corporate welfare. I thought, huh? But I think that there is an awareness among fiscal conservatives, and among which I count myself, that this is not, that strategy, that particular strategy, is not going to work because the states themselves don't have sufficient bargaining power, and if they attract a single large company like New York, which is at the top of the heap in giving subsidies, just invested $1.2 billion in this advanced micro devices plant, which is then sold to the Qataris. The whole area around is going bankrupt now because there's no supply chain. The big company is saying, where's our supply chain? But there's no capital to invest in the supply chain. So we're going back to this whole model of investing in the Saturn plant, no supply chain, giving huge amounts of the public purse to very large companies that then don't have any commitment to those locations. So I think this is, strangely enough, becoming a very clear bipartisan issue. I've been very surprised about this, but I think that people are becoming aware when it comes to spending public money that this is not a good expenditure of public money. But that seems to be one of the few strategies that we have. The strategies we hear about are decreasing corporate taxes. Go ahead, it's not going to do me that much good. It just gets passed on anyway. I don't, corporate taxes. And then competing in the world of place-based a competition where you essentially provide even greater subsidies to attract the very large manufacturing firms. Now, I don't want to be a purist about this, because I think that there are good reasons for providing subsidies. For example, food processing companies still employ significant workforces. And so you can make investments in the facilities and services and training of food processing companies, and you will get a reasonable return on your public investment. But I think they're the exception right now. So there's a strategy here of knowing how to do this, but I think in general the problems lie in the supply chains. Yes.
I've done work with 7 manufacturing industries in São Paulo, Brazil, in the end of the 90s, and a lot of what you're saying came true then too, and it's been interesting how they've been dealing with it now in the economic growth period. But when I ask them why are they importing all of these auto parts from Germany, for example, when they've had a lot cheaper labor, qualified labor, and they said because they didn't have the money, those auto part smaller firms, the suppliers, right, to put into things like process and innovation, Germany had. So it was still better to import those auto parts in terms of quality and even cost,
durability,
and
yes.
The other thing that was happening is the high interest rates. And so the international firms were able to get it internationally, the financing, but the smaller national firms weren't. So they were not able to put money into any kind of innovation and process and product But now that's gradually changing, so it'd be interesting for me to go back to those same firms and see, has that really then changed their ability, those smaller firms, to go into process and innovation. But what was happening, the smaller firms did find a niche in the sense that some of things like drill bits and stuff, the old machines required certain kind of male and female parts, right? And that, you know, I have to learn all of this language in Portuguese, but anyway, and so they were able to provide those specialized things for the local market that these multinationals were not producing, those parts that then could fix those machinery and stuff like that. But what's interesting now is the blossoming of credit cards and this whole, you know, world out there of these favela people living in favelas now having credit cards, and they're saying it's going to boost the economy because they can buy, right? But a lot of that stuff is coming from China and stuff like that. So what is then going to happen? They're also able to get mortgages now to buy apartments and stuff like that. And so it's very likely it's going to follow then the U.S. in terms of the you know, people getting so indebted and stuff like that. And I don't know if these firms are also going the way of, you know, providing credit. And I know the auto companies are, right? So you can buy it, you know, on credit from them and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think also the major manufacturing companies did move into providing credit. That was certainly GE moved into that realm. So they became financial service firms, essentially. I do think my particular interest on the positive side of this is I think there's manufacturing capacity. There are supply chains, certainly in Chicago and in Great Lakes cities. So to me then, that's where maybe the solution may lie, is figuring out alternatives to get new kinds of capital that is going to have a longer term time horizon. I think there's going to be innovation in financial products and services in a way in the United States, because we are more innovative in that way.
But I mean, we give mortgages, right? 30-year mortgages.
But we had innovation on the sort of negative side. We also have a history. I'm somebody who believes that nothing comes out of nothing. So we have a history of credit unions, of different kinds of capital that does have a longer timeline, and that kind of capital may begin to increase in importance. And there could be incentives that encourage that.
Yeah, what would be those incentives? Where would that incentive come from for that to happen?
Well, I would see it coming from the regulatory structure, but I may be wrong about that. I don't know how you undo what happened. That's the other thing. I think I'm kind of with you on this. That, you know, this has happened. We aren't going to be able to undo this and go backwards. So the question is, how do you find new strategies, new incentives to address this longer term investment horizon problem? Yeah. Yes.
Sort of going along that route and bringing it more to a local level, Chicago has some great incubator spaces here. Doing innovative stuff like ICNC in the Kinsey Corridor or Blue 47 in Pilsen. So I was wondering, you mentioned policy incentives, and I was wondering if you have any suggestions or any thoughts on what kind of incentives at a local level for innovation for manufacturing, because that's what ICNC does, well, partly. They do some food service work and other just product innovation. Blue 47 is more media and digital stuff. So
I do see there have been these kinds of strategies, like in Ithaca, New York, we have the Alternatives Federal Credit Union that provides loans to small businesses with a longer term. They have expertise, they have local expertise. We've got to build up capital, sources of capital that have some kind of expertise about investing over the longer term and that are willing to take lower profits. Revolving loan funds. There's a question both of the sources of capital, and that's a problem because how are these smaller lenders supposed to get access to capital themselves? And you know so there has to be some sort of multi-level, national, state, local analysis of this. So, Howard, do you want to call a halt to this? Are you? Because it's after. You look like you were.
No, it's not. We can go to 4:30.
Oh, okay. I didn't want to keep everybody here if you're. So, but I would say that there are local alternatives, but I think that this is, part of my argument is that our whole economy went in a certain direction, and so you're creating competition among places and businesses that are driven by these incentives, and so no matter what you do locally, you're sort of going against the tide, and so there has to be thought given to the incentives at the.
And also remember, rates are extremely low right now. They only have one way to go, which is real rates have to rise, which means the present value of what you own today goes down, which is a built-in structural perversion to ever lending money again. Especially in the long term. But think about it. You just it's not rational to make a 10-year loan now, no matter what.
Yeah, well, and that was a indirect tax on certain people, withholding. So, yeah, that was one of the ways that we innovated our way out of the crisis. So, but you had a question.
Well, yeah, several things. I mean, I go back probably longer than you, or at least as long as you, but it's in various ways. I think there's a couple of things. I think one is to talk about manufacturing as a monolith is a mistake.
Yes.
All right? That really, part of the trend you talk about is, you want to talk about the, if you will, the decreasing employment, changing in manufacturing, goes back to the 60s, and there was a decline in employment going back in the 50s and 60s as productivity increased. So I think you can talk about Kodak as it's a version to new technology because they didn't need to. Right? They were making a lot of money until they couldn't. It's a larger discussion. But I think manufacturing goes, the manufacturing that we've lost in this country and to the extent in the UK is what we call commodity manufacturing. All right? And there was a company in Chicago back in the 70s called Strombecker. They made little action figures. Well, action figures itself for 69 cents.
Yeah.
All right? I don't care how low the wages go. It's always going to be a huge percentage of your final cost. That was eventually, and they stayed here a long time, and no subsidies were ever going to keep them around. All right? Whereas a Caterpillar or what a company used to call Cincinnati Millicron or something, I don't know if it still exists anymore, it's been bought by somebody, but whatever, you have a machine that costs $200,000, all right? Labor costs are always going to be a small percentage of that. The technology goes in. So there's two separate ones. You lost the other ones. And so the other ones, that's where you have opportunities, where they ran into trouble starting in the, if you will, the 90s, is that they were competing with, this is why I came to hear about financialization, because the returns for the financial service industry were 40%.
Yes.
All right? I was working in investing and trying to get manufacturing companies, and even the best ones with the most advanced technology, I was looking at 12 and 14%.
Yeah.
All right?
That's
venture
high,
firms,
too.
and that was very high.
Yeah.
All right? But the problem is the venture firm, that's what skewed the investment. All right? It's less long-term versus short-term. It's a question of what returns. That's how the banks then pushed in the deregulation in the 90s because they wanted to get the higher returns.
Yeah.
They were prohibited with Glass-Steagall. All right, so that therefore they had to go and find other ways to get higher returns, which then it's a very logical thing to just a few years ago and all those mortgage, the innovation in financial, products. I mean, I was a tool and die maker, so the idea of financial products, I find, still is a disconnect in my brain. Right? So I think, but that's what it is, and we still have the residue of it. I mean, and even the big companies have the same problem. I mean, a number of years ago, I was flying to Los Angeles, and there was a company, they announced that these special meals. Some people have heard this story from me before, but it was, and they had this thing, and they were healthy choice meals that were made by Cargill, all right, which is no small player, I might add. All right, and they were going, they had this special thing, and it was half frozen, half hot, and they had this wonderful, special, these things are going to be a great thing, and they give it to you. The problem was that in order to lock it in place so that it could actually be frozen and heated at the same time, all right, they had a lip on it. So if you put it straight on your tray, it would be at an angle.
Oh.
So you had to actually put it all the way off the side. All right, now, I was a tool and die maker, I was a chemist, I got upset. I thought, this is irrational. What idiot could have possibly designed this?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out next to me was the vice president from Garfield, who was
Oh, wow.
responsible for doing it.
That always happens on airplanes, doesn't
It
it?
does, it is. All right, and he listened to me rant and
Yeah.
told him all sorts of names for about 15 minutes and told me who he was. And he said his problem was that he wouldn't lose his job, and they closed the plant. And he realized it was a disaster, and United would never advertise this thing again. But he had 6-week profit marks to meet,
Yeah.
not quarterly. 6 weeks, and this is Cargill.
Oh my God. That's crazy.
All right. Well, he can't possibly think
Right, 6 weeks.
6 weeks. You make a decision and you go.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Now that's where the financialization comes in, because Cargill, even Cargill, was being pressed by for those kinds of returns.
Right.
All right. But on the other hand, you have other companies. The reason you have companies like Macquarie and others to invest in, if you will, classic commodities, Rose, because they have pension funds. All right. Morgan Stanley didn't put up most of the money for the city parking meters. It was the Ontario and the Texas retirement systems, and actually the Chicago Police Benevolent Fund actually was another investor. All right, because they have a very long horizon. They
Yes.
want to get a lower return. They have the lower return that will last for 40 years. So the whole thing is much more complex. It's not as simple. It's manufacturing. Right? There's a whole set of things to it. Where the location calculus comes in, all right, is where in those industries where the labor is a very small percentage, where it's transportation. Look where Boeing wanted to build. Rockford was one of the finalists because they have a labor force. So I think all these things are much more complicated. It is the financialization which has driven it over the last 30 years. All right? But it also has, the industry has divided. It's no longer just one thing of manufacturing.
Well, I don't think it ever was one thing.
No, but when I came out of high school and I worked in the factory, there was. So it was all very similar, right? There was lots of places to go. All right, but now when I work for the county, I do investment and look at other transportation, I'm looking at, or working for advised funds, I'm looking at a much more complicated system than just one thing in manufacturing. It's no longer, which when I was 17, it was.
But
GE was similar to US Steel, which is, or whatever.
I would say, I agree with you that manufacturing is very diverse and that these processes are affecting some sectors and some firms more than others. I do think that the time to investment return is still important as much as the level of investment return, because manufacturing just is slower as well as, so. Then the other thing is that the material, the literature that I've read on this in terms of the loss of those 4 million jobs suggested that it was, the people who would make the argument that this was disinvestment say it isn't that we just lost the commodity jobs. We lost other types of jobs too, because companies, for example, could go to Singapore and get their research and development subsidized. There are these other kinds of deals that are being made. So large firms could go to Ireland, they could go to Singapore. So it wasn't simply a matter of losing on the lower end. We lost at all levels, and that's why it was so profound and deep.
I agree, but it's also, the companies were also, especially the multinationals, want to diversify, all right? All right, I spent a lot of time looking at the chemical industry back in the 70s, all right? And actually, they actually, once they had an opportunity to diversify their commodity chemicals, their bulk chemicals, they did that in a flash. They spent billions building plants over there because their transportation costs dropped,
Yeah.
and therefore they could diversify their risk. That's what was driving them. All right? And that was that prime of the disinvestment in this country because they could move lots of places.
But I think that Peter's point earlier about the kind of expertise that exists in these financialized manufacturing companies now is different
It is.
from when you started working too. It's about how to diversify risk, how to increase capital returns. It may not be, I know this just from knowing people who come out of business schools and run companies. They don't know how to make a widget. They don't, they don't have any of that kind of, the way that people in Germany typically do.
Right.
They have knowledge, expertise about financial products and risk diversification, not about
My
product and
ability
process
to know how to make a
innovation.
widget goes in the category of trivia. All right, I do financial stuff now,
Yeah.
and that's only that happens to be an odd bit of my family. That's why I do well at trivia games. But no, it's not relevant. I agree.
Well, but it's just that this is part of the change we're talking about. Yes.
Hi, I teach in the Department of Anthropology, and I'm actually just developing a course in economic anthropology. And I read a very interesting book by an economic sociologist called Economy of Words. And in fact, I think he teaches in upstate, one of the SUNYs in upstate New York. And
Economy of words.
It's called The Economy of Words, and it's Douglas Holmes, I think is his last name. And it's a very interesting, so he located himself ethnographically with 4 or 5 central banks, New Zealand, I think Scotland, Germany, so that he located himself with central bankers in various parts of the Western world. And it was fascinating because you were talking about financialization as a spatialized in spatialized registers. He says that in the post, financial crisis period, it's impossible to talk about economies without actually talking about the discursive element of what financialization really means.
Yes.
Right? So these central bankers, and he says when he first started his fieldwork, he would sit there and look at interest rates and all of these things, and the central banker said, no, we don't care about these things. They are the ones actually constructing through words, so it doesn't matter at the end of the day what interest rates are and how, supply chains. It's really the construction, I'm not suggesting those are not important,
Yeah.
but it's very interesting because you cannot talk about financialization, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, without talking about the actors who are really responsible for creating, these ideas about what
The stories, the narratives about the ownership economy, and yes, there's all kinds of stories about investment advisors and what they can tell you, and there is a whole cultural narrative about finance and why you should be part of it,
because I guess to talk about financialization without thinking about who are the actors behind the actual markets are social.
Yes.
Right? So it's a question of, so I was just, it's very provocative because there is a very important, I think, spatial dimension to what you've been talking about.
Can I just say though, I think one of the reasons I talk about this in the way that I do in terms of incentives is that particularly in the United States, less so in the UK, but also the narratives about any kind of economic problem have to do with individuals. Michael Milliken, or, you know, junk bonds, or we can name the Enron people. It's those individual, it's part of the celebrity culture, I think, you know, these are criminals like Bernie Madoff, you know. Nothing would have gone wrong if we didn't have Bernie Madoff. And so I think that my tendency is not that I don't think that actors are important, but I think that part of the way that these kinds of problems are talked about in this particular cultural economy, you know, is identifying individual actors and attributing responsibility to them and ignoring the broader, which is also created by actors, but the broader incentives and how they're created and in fact encourage certain kinds of behaviors and not others. So, yes.
I mean, it's very provocative. I think it's very interesting for me, as someone who's interested in sort of maybe the more specific dynamics, to look at how these broader dynamics get spatialized, but you cannot ignore the fact that they also get spoken into being to some extent.
Part of the financial discourse too is a sort of, I think, has a big effect on manufacturing because there's such a sort of premium placed on liquidity, and manufacturing is viewed as the sort of antithesis. With all the capital investment and the equipment, it's like these are such sort of almost like quintessentially illiquid items. They're durable, and they're also then subject to sort of devalorization, right? And devaluation, you know, if the economic winds change, whereas you see within the financial world a real premium placed on sort of, you know, the furthest away you can get from the material, the better, you know? It's sort of like, you know, if it shows up as a blip on a computer screen, or if it's a, you know, a pool of mortgages and just, you know, and income streams that you can just put a value on, like there's a premium placed on that, but you hear sort of folks in the you know, who work in financial markets, and they talking about you know, sort of real live factories and equipment and stuff, and it's always sort of with a sort of a kind of negative or pejorative sort of a sense. And so I've definitely sort of picked up on that, which I don't think helps manufacturing at all to be associated with those kinds of you know, a sort of like your example of looking at the assets and saying, like, what are all these assets, Hunter? Like, get them off, right? It's like we don't understand them, and more or less, like, they're a liability.
They're a liability. Yeah, assets are a liability. I think one of the ways that I got into this over a long period of time too is this whole depiction of certain parts of the country as failures because they have manufacturing. This Rust Belt baloney. This is a way of portraying certain places as failures and ignoring, again, the broader incentives that in fact restructured those economies or caused people to leave or whatever. You say, oh, Buffalo, you know, they must be stupid there because people left, or there's too much snow, or there's something, you know, instead of looking at the incentives that were driving this. And so you create this pejorative, you create a narrative about places. And ironically, when the financial bubble burst, the places in the Northeast and Midwest did fairly well. Partly they weren't places where anybody wanted to speculate, and it was Arizona and Florida and those. But nobody would say, "Oh, those terrible Sunbelt places," you know. They're all because there was still this. The people didn't know how to create a new narrative that would say, "Oh, there's something wrong there." You know, there was something going wrong there. So I just am constantly fighting against these narratives that depict places and try to either give them credit or depict them as failures, when in fact there are broader forces, dynamics that are in fact discouraging investment or encouraging investment or, creating opportunities.
I think, Serena, it's great that you brought in this notion of the discursive elements that you articulated. Discursive elements being used discursive elements being used by individuals to represent their interests, right, and to convince everybody else that these interests then are legitimate and are the way they are because that's how they ought to be. And part of what it's doing is disguising, as you say, these sort of larger forces. And some of the larger forces have a logic, right, of its own that is on this sort of fast-track rail car, right? Specifically, the drive and the imperative to continually expand capital, right, and expand profits, expand the accumulation of capital, and so on. So there's a capital there that's being accumulated that isn't being invested. And it's one of the things I was interested in. This sort of gets at why some of that capital isn't being let loose to be invested, right? Yeah. But one of the other thing that's interesting about what you say when we push, pushing yourself and the conversation, putting the issue out there, what are those incentives that encourage this kind of short-term thinking for the profit? And what are the disincentives and so on, right? That you keep going back to the regulatory structure, which raises the questions about the role of the state.
Yeah.
Right? And so, what else besides what should those regulations look like? What other dimensions of the state? Is the state our best option to intervene between sort of the interests of everybody and the interests of the sort of firm to expand its or firms to expand their continual accumulation of capital?
Yeah, I think that I do think it's impossible to go backwards once you. So I think getting rid of Glass-Steagall was a mistake.
Mm-hmm. Sure was.
But because of the story, because of the society's changed, the culture has changed. So you have to find a different route toward those longer term, encouraging those longer term incentives.
And what would those be? I mean, where is the pathway of our hope here?
Well, well, maybe it does mean creating a banking sector that is separated from the incentives to achieve very fast, high level.
Like an industrial bank of Japan or something like that.
Yeah. People have talked about industrial banks. Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the shale gas and oil situation, which is just a bubble and a half. And it's economically very problematic, but it's also environmentally problematic. And I saw, for example, an investment prospectus by a company encouraging, and I think globalization, global investment comes into this. The Chinese are there, they're investing, and then this was directed at Chinese investors. And this investment portfolio said, well, here's the bubble, because they do know that this is a bubble. We're going to get you out right there before it goes down. And so there's that kind of speculative, when people talk about casino capitalism, there is this encouragement of sort of, and we all, I don't want to exempt myself. I'm part of this culture. I don't want to exempt myself from being part of that either. That's part of what being an American is right now, unfortunately, maybe. But so you see yourself, playing this game and getting out before the bubble bursts. But so maybe we need to create more bounded financial institutions that have a different set of incentives, and that wouldn't be easy. But I don't see us not being engaged in continuous bubbles. with this. I just think we're gonna be in one bubble after another, or one kind or another, because of the drive for speculation. So, well,
Where do you want to go to develop more evidence on this?
I want to, well, there's a number of different, I want to look, well, we've talked about this, and I'm gonna pick Rachel's brain about this too. I want to look much more closely at companies in supply chains and the problems that they're having getting capital. I want to find out more about that, because I think that that's the critical area. And I think, appropriate to your question, what kinds of institutions or institutional changes could be developed or are out there, maybe being best practice, that are encouraging different kinds of investment patterns. So they could be emulated. Americans are very good at mimicking things. That's how we, best practice. We have this idea of best practice, which is kind of a joke, but we say it's best practice. When there really is no such thing, because of what you said. All these industries are different. They're really, but we like to find something that we can then emulate across, and we're good at that too. So I think those are two areas I'd like to look at, and I think that bring up to date some of the work that Greta Krippner did, looking at how the shape of the economy has changed. What kinds of the sort of broader patterns that indicate shifts away from investment in property-based areas where there's some real equity there, toward more ephemeral products. One of the reasons I don't use a PowerPoint is that I have diagrams. I have diagrams from Rob Atkinson. I have diagrams that I've made, but the time frames are all different. There's got to be a more coherent set of data that covers the same time frame and that shows a clear, coherent story, but I haven't had the ability to pull that together, which would take time and money. So, yeah, but I think, again, I'm trying to develop a narrative, because I don't think that you can make any kind of, you have to know what's going on before you make recommendations, and you have to get feedback and you have to get critique. But I think right now we've got very little discussion, alternative discussion about what these patterns have meant. And I am worried about continuous bubbles. I really am, because I think that leads, again, to people's fear of investing. They're gonna say, no, I'm gonna keep it under the pillow because I lost money, and then this lost money, and that lost money, and So, if anybody wants to come and hear about the shale gas bubble tomorrow, be my guest. Noon, right? Noon.
Yes.
Is it gonna be in this room too?
It's in this
Yes.
room.
Okay.
Please come back. Thank you so much.